Hamburg, New York. There is an old saying by George Santayana which states, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And now more than ever, no event in human history symbolizes this saying more than the Holocaust. For those who do not know, the Holocaust was the systematic mass genocide of 6 million Jews between the years 1939 and 1945. As indicated by this graph, anti-Semitism has dramatically risen in recent years. It is due to this that I believe the Holocaust education is an essential part of our nation's educational system. One way to teach people about this infamous event is by sharing the stories of people who lived through it. By sharing these stories, younger generations will not only be able to recognize forms of anti-Semitism, but they will also gain an understanding of the suffering that many of my fellow Jews went through. As stated from articles on VOA and PR Newswire, out of the entire US population, it was found that 48% of the population couldn't name one single concentration camp or ghetto. 11% believed that us Jews, the victims, caused the Holocaust, and 23% believe that it never happened, which is Holocaust denial. This is exactly a result of withholding education of this infamous event. It is this reason that I believe that by incorporating this education, we are able to decrease these numbers and also increase the number of people who believe it is essential to learn, which, as you can see, is 80 people. One of the many people that were impacted by the Holocaust was Robert Klein, who is actually my grandfather, or as I call him, Zadie, which is Yiddish for grandfather. My grandfather was born on March 11th, 1935 in Budapest, Hungary. He was the only child of my great-grandparents, Gino and Caitlin. Though he experienced anti-Semitism early on, it wasn't until late 1943, early 1944, when the Nazis invaded Budapest, that his family faced the full wrath of the Third Reich. One of the first things the Nazis did when they invaded Budapest was they forced all of the Jews to wear the infamous yellow star, which is considered to be the embodiment of anti-Semitism. There was even a rule back then that stated if you were older than 6 years old, you had to wear the yellow star. Around the time the Nazis invaded Budapest, Robert and his mother were sadly separated from Gino. He went to a labor camp called Bor, which is located around the Austro-Hungarian border, whereas Caitlin and Robert were sent to the ghetto. But they didn't go immediately to the ghetto. First, they were forced to march 16 to 19 miles to a brick factory outside of Budapest. There, they were put up for selection. The selection went like this. An SS soldier stood and pointed in two directions, to the right and to the left. If he pointed to the right, you were sent back to Budapest, pictured here, where you went to the ghettos. But sadly, if you pointed to the left, You were sent to Auschwitz, the most infamous concentration camp where you sadly met a grim fate. As you can tell by me being here today, Robert and Caitlin were among the many Jews that were pointed to the right, but when it was time for them to be selected, the fear within them is just incomprehensible to anyone like you or me. After the selection, Caitlin, Robert, and all of the other Jews who were pointed to the right were forced to remarch those 16 to 19 miles back to Budapest. But during that journey, they stopped here at the Dohányi Street Synagogue, which is considered to be the largest temple in the world. The Jews spent several days at this temple before completing their journey. During those several days, it was common for them to witness Nazis pile dead bodies in the temple's courtyard. The ghetto that my grandfather stayed at, as indicated by this image, was 16 Klausalter. One word can be used to describe the life of the Jews in the ghettos: horrific. First of all, the Nazis squeezed 15 to 20 families into a small 10 by 10 building. Second, just like Dohányi, it was commonplace for the Nazis to pile dead bodies in front of the ghetto. There were also frequent bombings. As my grandfather stated in a 1993 interview, the Russians bombed us, the Americans bombed us during the daytime, the nighttime. In fact, the bombings were so frequent that the Jews living there had to spend a lot of time in the basement to go against those bombings. The bombings also destroyed the water system at the ghetto, so the Jews were forced to compensate for a necessary living condition. They used large empty jugs as toilets, and when these toilets were full, they were emptied by throwing the contents outside. The most devastating part about living in the ghetto was that many innocent people died of starvation. Food and water were almost non-existent, and many Jews had to do whatever they could for food. In fact, one of the few ways they were able to obtain food was by going out in between bombings and scraping up what little crumbs of food they could find. This actually leads into what I believe to be the most impactful story that my grandfather told me about his experience, which I call the dead horse incident. When my grandfather was just 8 or 9 years old, he would go out between bombings with whatever sharp object he could find, whether it be a large knife or a knife as small as these pocket knives, and cut the meat off of a dead horse. Like I said, the Jews had to do whatever they could for food, and as my grandfather stated in that same 1993 interview, you're not picky when you're hungry. You eat whatever you can. I would also like to divert your attention to this image of the Danube River. This famous landmark separates Budapest into two sides: the Buda side and the Pest side, or as the locals call it, the Pest side. There's even a classical piece of music either written about or named after this river called the Blue Danube. But to my grandfather, this river was more red than blue. This was because Nazis would round up Jews and line them up along the river. Then, using machine guns, the Iron Cross soldiers would shoot all of the Jews who were lined up and let their bodies fall into the river. Interesting fact, this is the reason why my grandfather has never eaten seafood. This isn't an image of when he was liberated, but my grandfather and his family were finally liberated in the spring of 1945 by the Russians. He was just 10 years old, half my age when he was liberated. Back then, the Jews didn't have any radio, but they could tell that the war was ending. The bombings were becoming less frequent, the artillery firing was getting closer, and they simply heard it through word of mouth. My grandfather is also credited for saving his mother's life because during their time in the ghetto, Caitlin developed typhoid and lost a substantial amount of weight. So immediately after liberation, my grandfather was able to get her to a doctor where she received treatment. 2 months after liberation, Gino was able to reunite with his wife and son. That moment, that day, is considered to be one of the happiest days in their lives. To finish off today's presentation, there are two important impacts that I want to take note of about the Holocaust's impact on my grandfather. First, of all the things he experienced, the one thing that haunted him until the day he died was the smell of dead bodies. You just don't forget something like that. And second, the impact it had on his entire family. Before the Holocaust, Robert had 80 to 100 family members scattered within the city of Budapest, but sadly after this notorious event, that number dwindled down to just 3 people, him and his parents. As you can see, and as stated in a BBC News article titled "A Point of View, Why Survivor Stories Matter," it's important to teach people about events such as this so that they can grow awareness of the reality of another person's suffering, and more importantly, to ensure an event like this never happens again. In conclusion, I believe that Holocaust education should be practiced throughout the community, throughout the country, and throughout the world. And as shown through my presentation, it is one of the rudimentary steps that should be taken to prevent the spread of anti-Semitism. By teaching younger and older generations alike about this event, people will be able to stand up against anti-Semitism and make sure that it becomes a thing of the past. Thank you.